Hi, it's Carolina with alwaysexpectmore.com, and today I'm going to show you 3 different ways that you can square up your quilt blocks. Also, I've got 2 simple hacks just in case your quilt blocks weren't exactly perfect and you need to fudge a little. You ready? Let's get started. So these are going to be 4.5 inch finished or 5 inches squared up, and that means 5 inches squared up is 2.5 inches to the middle of the block. So this first method, I'm just going to use a regular ruler, and I will be using my spot on dots because you can just grab these and put them on and be able to see that middle really well. So I'm lining up against that middle, and I want it 2.5 inches out from the middle. So I grab my rotary cutter and I trim it up. Now I'll flip to the other side, and now I will line up this edge with an edge on my mat, and again go 2.5 inches using my spot on dot to find that mark. And now I can also line up the lines on my ruler with the lines on my mat so that everything is all squared up and straight. This edge is lined up, these lines are lined up, I'm matched up with the center, and I'm 2.5 inches out from the center on that side. So now I'm squared up to 5 inches these ways. I want to spin and do the same on the other side. So now I can match up my center to my 2.5 inch line, and then I can also match up my bottom and my top. There we go. To 2.5 inches on this side and 2.5 inches on the other side, which will also be a perfect 5 inch square at this point, since this is the last cut that I need to make. So I can line up along the bottom, I can line the center, I can line up all the lines. And there we go. Now I've squared up my block to perfectly 5 inches, which will be 4.5 inches finished in the quilt. Now that is a little tedious way of doing it if you just have a regular ruler. Even better would be if you have a nice big square ruler. And when people ask me what size square ruler should I buy, I say the bigger the better, because with this big 12.5 inch ruler I can square up all the way up to 12.5 inch blocks, but I can go as small as a 1 inch block if I wanted. It'd be a little cumbersome with a piece this big, but if you can afford the bigger rulers, because the bigger rulers are a little more expensive, go for the bigger ones. If you can't afford the bigger rulers, go for a 6.5 or an 8.5 if that's what's in your budget at this point. But you definitely want something that's the size of your blocks. In our case, we're squaring up to 5 inches. So with this one, you can cut 2 sides at a time, and it also has this nice angle. So I want that angle and my 2.5 inch lines to match up here in the middle. So I've got my 2.5 inch line here in the middle. I've got my 2.5 inch line. That looks pretty good. I can grab my spot on dot off my other ruler, put it here, and then this time I can cut 2 sides at the same time. Now all I have to do is lift it up, flip it 180 degrees, so 2 turns, and now this should line up along the 5 on the bottom, this should line up on the 5, this 2.5 and this center diagonal should hit the middle of my block, and with 2 cuts I've cut to 5 inches. So that is pretty amazing as well. Love using a nice big square. That's probably the most common way that you'll see for people squaring up blocks. However, there is another fun way to square up blocks, and this is using the Stripology Squared. I'm using the Stripology Squared Mini in this case. So I can just take my block and I can line it up. Now, this Stripology Squared has white lines and black lines. So the white lines will do the 1/2 inch. So if I wanted to cut this to 4.5, I would center in the middle and I would cut the 4.5 inch line here and the 4.5 inch line here. But since I'm doing whole numbers, so I'm doing the 5 inch. So at 2.5 right here is where I want to line up my center. So that's my 2.5 mark. And I'll be trimming to 5 inches on this side and 5 inches on this side. Five inches on this side and 5 inches on this side. So instead of cutting one side and the top, I'm cutting the two sides. Now I can turn 90 degrees. I can find that 2.5 mark. And if you're having trouble finding that 2.5 mark at all, you can just use your spot on dot. The spot on dot is adhesive and not suction. And so it'll stick even on this ruler with all these lines. And so now I'm going to cut right here and right here. And there we go. That's how you square up a block using the Stripology ruler. So some questions that I get when squaring up blocks is, well, what if my block is too small? I have all of these blocks and they're all squared up to 5 inches, but I have a block that I need to use in the quilt, but it got too small. So one option is to use coping strips. And this is where you just square it up smaller than you need it, and then you add a border around the edges. You can then square it up to whatever size you need. And in this case, we're going back to our 5 inches. And I'm just going to use this Stripology Squared because this is what I have handy, but this would work with any of the methods that we have. And here are some tips when you're using coping strips. So when you're using coping strips, you want to make sure that there is going to be at least a 1/2 inch showing when you cut the strip, because then you'll have a 1/4 inch for seam allowance and a 1/4 inch that's actually showing of your coping strip. You really don't want to go smaller than a 1/4 inch if you can help it. So cut your block smaller if needed to be able to fit that coping strip. Also, you don't have to do a coping strip on all 4 sides. You could do it on just 2 sides and have like a cool echo on 2 sides, or kind of a shading on 2 sides. So that's another option if you're off only by a little bit. I like doing it on all 4 sides. And in this case, I cut my block to 4.5 inches. So when I added the coping strips with my 1/4 inch seam allowance, I ended up with a 4 inch. And so when I bring it to 5 inch, I will have a 1/2 inch on each side. It's kind of a lot of math. If you're worried about it, just cut it smaller and add some really big strips and then trim it down. No big deal. Or you can always sketch it out. That's another option. So I'm going to line this all up. Cut on a 5 inch and on the 0. Now in this case, I didn't have it all the way down to the bottom here, so I didn't cut all the way through, but that's fine. I'm gonna go ahead and spin. This is more than enough fabric, so I'm just gonna cut it out of my way because I don't care what that edge looks like. I just want to make sure that, here we go, that this is at 5 inches. So now this block will have a fun little border when it's in the quilt, and it'll just help it stand out a little different. And as we like to say in quilting, it's not a mistake, it's a design element. Okay, so what do you do if you have a block that is just a little shy? It's not enough that you need a coping strip, but it's just a little shy. So then what you can do is you can iron it onto a piece of freezer paper. So this is applique freezer paper by the Gypsy Quilter, and you can find this at many quilt stores and at independent quilt stores online. And you just iron your block on, and here's a tip for ironing it on, is that you don't want to put your block on and then iron it on top, because this is kind of plasticky and it'll melt to your iron. Put your block face down, then put the freezer paper on top and iron it down let it cool a little bit, and just peel it right up off your ironing board, and you'll have some fuzzies from your ironing board, but no big deal. So now we can take this and we can cut it down using whatever method we like. And if I look at this block and I bring it all the way over to this corner, I would say that I could actually trim this up at a 5.5 for a different project. So I can say, okay, I'm cutting this one at 5.5. Pivot. Line this up. So there you go. You can see that I have a little bit of freezer paper showing on all of these edges, but that's okay. Now what I'll do is I'll take any of my rulers and a pen, and I'm going to draw a 1/4 inch line on the back. And this is my seam allowance line, and I'm drawing this on the paper. When I sew this into my quilt, what I'm going to do is I am going to use a shorter stitch length. So bring your stitch length down and sew it just as if it was a regular square getting sewn into fabric. When it's done being stitched into the quilt, then you can gently peel away the paper, and that short stitch length stitching on these lines will give you like a perforation, so you'll just be able to take this off and it'll peel right off of your quilt block and rip off at those seams. And so that way you've given yourself some wiggle room. However, and this is a huge however, you don't have a full 1/4 inch seam allowance on these spots. You have absolutely weakened your seams by giving yourself a smaller seam allowance. And that can be a big deal in a quilt. So what you want to do when you finish this quilt is you want to quilt it more densely. You want to make sure that you're not just stitching in the ditch next to the seam, you're actually stitching across these seams, and that's going to help strengthen these weaker seams because you don't have that full 1/4 inch seam allowance in there. So there you go. Here are your 3 different methods for squaring up a block, ways to use coping strips, and ways to cheat a little bit when your block is just a touch short. I hope you enjoyed this video. Go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below, and make sure you're subscribed to this channel because I have all kinds of fun quilting and crafting updates to share with you, and you'll be the first to know if you subscribe and hit that bell. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. Make sure you've given this video a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you're the very first to get all of my best crafting and quilting updates. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.